Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Dharna Noor. A United Nations report obtained by The Intercept shows that the UN has found US and EU sanctions to be worsening the humanitarian crisis in Syria. The report, titled Humanitarian Impact of Syria-Related Unilateral Restrictive Measures, found that the detrimental impact on aid, trade, healthcare, and national infrastructure is taking a toll on citizens. It concludes, quote, "Unless addressed now, the impact of sanctions will last well after the sanctions are either removed or modified and may create a new catastrophe in terms of crippling economic and humanitarian effects." Joining us now to discuss this is Rania Khalek. Rania is an associate editor at the Electronic Intifada and a co-host of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. Her latest article for The Intercept is titled US and EU Sanctions Are Punishing Ordinary Syrians and Crippling Aid Work, UN report reveals. Thanks for joining us today, Rania.
Good to be on with you.
So take us through who put this report together and what ways the sanctions are impacting the lives of ordinary Syrians as well as the humanitarian operations in Syria.
So the report was commissioned by the UN to basically study and analyze the humanitarian impact of US and EU sanctions on Syria, especially in light of the humanitarian crisis, which is the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, is what it's being described as. And what they found is that speaking to NGO workers across the board, various non-governmental organizations that are providing aid relief to Syria have come across various stumbling blocks because of the U.S. and EU sanctions. And a lot of these NGOs reported that aid delivery, was actually being blocked by these sanctions, including things that are urgently needed in Syria at the moment, like medicines and medical devices and blood safety kits and spare parts for everything, from water pumps to trucks and cars to power plants, and these are just basic things that any country would need on a given basis. But in Syria, where you've got bombs falling and, bullets flying, a lot of critical infrastructure has been destroyed. And so it's taking these aid groups months to basically even procure the kinds of spare parts that they need to repair damages done to, critical infrastructure. And then there's the other issue of, that's just like the aid issue aside, there's the other issue of the fact that, it's destabilized the Syrian economy because there's sanctions on Syrian banks. So the banking system doesn't even work in Syria because Syrians, they can't, they can't make any transactions whatsoever. They can't, ATMs, PayPal, all of these things, they don't function in Syria. Everything's cash and, remittance. And so what's happened is it's also difficult just to basically get funds into the country. And because other banks are scared of sanctions, they often reject, transactions. They won't even do them if they're with Syria, even if they're legal transactions that aid groups need. So sometimes aid groups can't even pay their staff on the ground or pay their suppliers. And what the report says is that because of that, oftentimes aid to both government and besieged areas in Syria is being prevented and delayed. And so, that's serious. In a humanitarian catastrophe like this, where you see the clear need for especially medical aid, the fact that it's not being let in is just compounding a catastrophe.
So why did these sanctions exist in the first place? What's sort of the history of these EU sanctions and these U.S. sanctions?
Well, so there's been sanctions on Syria even before the 2011 uprising started. Syria has been under U.S. sanctions since 1979, but those sanctions were ramped up after 2011 because of the Syrian regime's deadly crackdown on protesters. And at first, they were targeted sanctions against particular individuals in the Syrian government, but they ended up evolving into just like blanket sanctions over the whole country. And so you can't do any business with any Syrian government entity. And so, if you think about what that means, that means you can't do business with the Ministry of Education if you're an aid group on the ground. You can't do business with anyone in the Syrian government. You're not supposed to be doing business with anyone in the Syrian government. And then it's also, it's impacting Syrians overall too, because it's also impacted food. That's another issue that's taking place, is where food is being affected. Food aid, not just food aid, but also the people's ability to actually produce it. So Syria used to be a country that was fairly self-sufficient in things like food production and even medicine production. And now, because of the civil war, which again has destroyed a lot of infrastructure, and then the sanctions added on top of that, it's actually really, really difficult, next to impossible, for like medicine factories or agriculture areas to get the equipment that they need, or the raw products that they need to produce things. So Syria's economy went from being like self-sufficient to now it's completely aid dependent. And so your average Syrian is dependent. I mean, that's like 13 million Syrians are dependent on aid for their basic needs now. And something like 80% of the country is living in poverty since the civil war started, and the sanctions have played a role in that as well. And so it makes no sense. I mean, the idea of the sanctions, the purpose of them is the U.S. official line here is to weaken the regime, is to weaken the Assad regime and put pressure on them to end their military offensives and to come to the negotiating table. That's what the U.S. says. But in fact, if anything, what I was told is that it's actually in a way empowering the Syrian government, because now the vast majority of Syrians are dependent on the government to get by, because the government's trying, still paying out pensions and still paying out salaries and offering all these subsidies. So, I mean, and if anything, people are more dependent on the government than they were before. So it's not even working. Just like the humanitarian issue aside, when it comes to the idea of weakening the government, it's not working. I mean, we've seen this in history. Sanctions do not hurt the governments. They end up hurting the people. And even if they are hurting the governments, is it worth hurting ordinary civilians this way? You look at what we did in Iraq. That was UN-led sanctions, but the U.S. was, the big pusher of those sanctions. And what ended up happening is that, Iraq's infrastructure deteriorated to the point where something like 500,000 children under the age of 5 ended up dying from various things like lack of medication, starvation, preventable diseases. So right now we're into a 5, almost 6-year civil war in Syria. And the humanitarian situation on the ground is really bad. And should it get worse, you could imagine something similar happening along the lines that happened in Iraq. Perhaps the only thing that's standing in the way of that at this point is the fact that at the UN Security Council, Russia and China have vetoed attempts by the U.S. and its allies to push for UN-led sanctions, which would be catastrophic in a humanitarian sense.
Now, most of the blame for the crisis in Syria is placed on the shoulders of Bashar al-Assad, right? So how have U.S. officials responded to these findings that sanctions are contributing to the suffering there? If the sanctions are creating all this suffering and they're not really achieving their political goals, are there signs that they'll be lifted?
No, there aren't. And, in fact, despite the fact that they're not working, and that they're hurting ordinary people, I asked the State Department about that, and their response was that this is all Bashar al-Assad's fault. He's the one causing the humanitarian catastrophe, and they've denied completely that sanctions were hurting civilians, even though it's clear they are. And that's kind of been the U.S. line since, any sanctions, whether it's been on Iran or Iraq or now Syria, that's always been the U.S. line. But the fact of the matter is that it's not the case. And on top of that, you have to remember, too, that the U.S., it's not just sanctions. The U.S. is also spending at least $1 billion annually arming the Syrian opposition. And I mean, that these are just like different factions of groups. And the UN doesn't really know, the U.S. doesn't really know who they're arming, but they are. And that's just the U.S. You also got other countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey. There's all these other countries that are arming and supplying aid to this insurgency. And so they are, in effect, also fueling the conflict. And so for the U.S. to be spending $1 billion every year to be arming and funding an insurgency that's prolonging a war, and then at the same time to be obstructing aid and putting in place these sanctions measures that are denying aid to people, I think that just goes to show you what the hypocrisy of U.S. policy. And there are people, from the U.S., like the opposition advocates inside the United States, especially those in Congress, have been pushing hard to not only strengthen the sanctions against Syria, but also to extend them to any entity that does business with any part of the Syrian government. And so, of course, that means Russia. That would mean taking these draconian sanctions and placing them on Russia, which would just escalate what it seems to be this, revival of the Cold War. So I don't know, what good can come out of that, but there are people who are pushing for it. Obama apparently vetoed that measure. That was recently reported, but assuming that Hillary Clinton's going to be the next president, I assume that she's probably going to go the other route. She's demonstrated in her rhetoric, at least, that she wants to escalate not only the U.S. involvement in Syria, which has not been in action. The U.S. has been very active in Syria, but she also wants to go even further and institute a no-fly zone. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. But in the meantime, civilians are suffering. It's not just one group or one government that's causing it. It's lots of governments that are causing it.
Rania's latest for The Intercept is U.S. and EU sanctions are punishing ordinary Syrians and crippling aid work, UN report reveals. Thanks so much for joining us, Rania, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Great to be with you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.